Every month it seems as if there's another report telling us how many hours of video games children play, or how many hours of TikTok they're scrolling through, or television they're watching. But those statistics barely scratch the surface of helping us to understand the media content available to children today. It's massive and growing and changing. In 2020, TikTok surpassed YouTube as the #1 destination for kids 4 to 18. But you probably know a child who still loves watching their favorite TV shows on Nickelodeon, maybe online, or even PBS. Today, Media Inside Out explores trends in children's media with 2 experts from the UK. We're in Manchester, England, and both guests develop and create content for kids here. How are these changes affecting what gets produced? What's the good news, and where are their concerns? We'll talk about trends in the industry, the role of educational media, and how long before kids take over the metaverse. Let's go inside. Please join me in welcoming my guests, Andrew Tomlinson, who's Head of Content and Commissioning at the BBC for BBC Bite Size, BBC Food, and BBC Children's and Education. And John Hancock is the Managing Director at 3 Arrows Media. They're award-winning producers of kids and family factual and educational content. Thank you both for joining me here in my new set for the time being.
Great to be here.
Thanks. So the first question I have for both of you is about, let's just talk about things that you like about children's media right now. Like, can you give me an example of something that, it could be a video game, it could be a television show, something that you or your children, or you just happen to be aware of professionally, that you think is doing a good job now? Andrew.
Yeah, I think the crossover between entertainment and education, which is kind of my space, there's some really interesting things going on there. And one of the things that has really impressed me over the last year is something that was developed between BBC Education and BBC Children's, which is the Horrible Histories game. So Horrible Histories is
Horrible
a brand
Histories, everything
in the
is great.
UK, which is, you know, as you can imagine, is a comedy-based production around historical events, but obviously has a huge amount of educational value in it. And we built a game around Vikings and how the Viking civilization developed, and which is aimed at Key Stage 2, which here in the UK is children aged 8, 9, 10,
Okay.
so that they can learn that history, but also build on that brand, that entertainment brand that is Horrible Histories, and the two things join together in a game which has several levels and takes them through the whole history of Vikings. So that's something I really love at the moment, that game space.
We're going to also figure out a way to get a link so that people can take a look at Horrible Histories if they haven't seen it, because it's really awesome. How about you, John?
Well, I'm going to go for an animated property which has been out in the UK for a while, Hey Duggee. And the reason why I like it is because of just how funny it is. It is funny full stop. It's not just funny for children. There's so much in there for grown-ups, and I'm a huge advocate, huge fan of co-viewing, of families kind of watching together, and for that to be done at its best, it requires there to be something in it for everyone. And so I love the wholesome values that kind of underpin it, but the fact that it is genuinely entertaining for all ages. I think it's a really, it's no mean achievement to be able to do that, and they do it fantastically well.
That whole idea of seeing things on 2 different levels and the parents being able to watch, I mean, that's what Bluey achieves really well as well, isn't it? So Bluey, Hey Duggee, great.
Yeah. So, but let's dig into that a little bit, because I think that idea of encouraging parents to be able to sit, or some adult person to sit with their child and consume media with them together, whatever it might be, is like, as you said, no easy feat. Like, what are sort of key ingredients of making that happen?
I think it's well, there are many, but one of them is great scripting, where and I know it's a little bit of a cliche, but where things can be seen and understood on different levels. And those two kind of brands that we've just been talking about do exactly that. So, you know, if you are a parent, you can get those jokes that the kids don't get, but it doesn't exclude them. It doesn't feel like you're excluding the children. There's still a narrative there for them, which works absolutely brilliantly for them, but also works for the parent. I think that's the key, isn't it?
Yeah,
the script.
Definitely. I think there's something about being really true to themselves. They have a very clear sense of what they are, and they really kind of zone into that. Yeah, I think there's always, it feels like the best shows that come to market are ones that really know themselves really well. And you know, if this was easy to do, we'd all be coming up with Blueies and Hey Duggies. So it's incredibly hard, even though it appears simple. I think for Hey Dougie, there's a really important kind of fact that there is an adult character kind of in there, which parents can identify to, as Bluey is set around the family dynamic as well. I think when we represent the family, it's easier for family to kind of come to it and to watch it in, you know, all together.
Yeah,
and I think there's a sense of authenticity in both of those brands, isn't there, where they're not glossing over some of the issues that happen within families. They're dealing with them, and there's no sense of like, we can't talk about that in front of the kids. And I think that's something that they both share, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely agree.
That's great. So one of the big differences, I think, between the US media system for children especially in the UK is around funding. And even though there have been changes with this recently, there has been a Young Audiences Content Fund in the UK for the last few years. That was really a chunk of money designated to, well, actually I would rather have one of you sort of explain your perspective on that, and what's happened. And you've received some funding, 3 Arrows has received some funding from that.
Yeah, we have.
Talk about that.
So I'll try and explain the kind of genesis of the fund. My understanding and my recollection of it is that the BBC, through no kind of fault of its own, has a monopoly kind of within the UK of commissioning for UK and children's contents. These stats are probably a little old, but I imagine they're probably fairly accurate, that some years ago they were commissioning 87%, I think it was, of all UK originated kids content. And that was primarily influenced by the fact that ITV and the children's ITV brand had been, their funding had absolutely dropped out because of rules quite rightly put in place that prevented fast food advertising to be kind of focused towards children. It meant that the advertising revenue kind of fell out of the market for them, and they weren't in a position to be able to commission as much as they had been. So in order to try and address this kind of balance, the Young Audiences Content Fund was set up, administered by the BFI, British Film Institute here, and its purpose was to try to stimulate other public service broadcasters other than the BBC into commissioning more children's and young audiences content.
And another public service broadcaster other than the BBC would be what?
So Channel 5, ITV, Channel 4. Those are kind of the principal other broadcasters.
But the funding didn't actually go to those broadcasters. The funding went to individual producers that applied, right?
Two ways in which the fund worked. One was a development fund. So they welcomed ideas from either individual kind of creators or production companies, and they kind of funded development pieces and gave assistance to those creators to try and get the ideas out to broadcasters. And then there was also a production fund, which if a project was successful with winning funding from that, it would match fund whatever a broadcaster put into the pot. So lots of series came to pass that wouldn't have otherwise been commissioned, where the broadcasters were only putting in effectively 50%.
Right.
Well, probably less than 50%, because there's a tax credit here that's available as well. So it made the small amount of money that broadcasters had available go much, much further.
So, and what I started saying in the beginning about the difference, so there is no fund like that in the US,
Sure.
right? In some level, right, there's government funding that goes for public broadcasting. They are the only public service broadcaster that receives funding from the government. And there isn't production funding like that at all. And sadly, at least at this point, right, the 3 years of that fund has come to an end.
Yep.
And I don't want to say it's not going to be renewed, but it doesn't look
Well, there's certainly a lot
likely.
of lobbying quite rightly taking place, that this is it's a devastating blow to the children's industry. And there are some, wonderfully kind of experienced people in the industry here who campaign relentlessly for it or something like it to be reintroduced, and we're frustratingly early in that journey, because it was only decided to be scrapped at the beginning of this year. But we'll be fighting hard for it, because it's incredibly important that we have a variety of broadcasters commissioning great quality content that serves the UK audience. You know, it's really important.
Yeah, and I agree, and I think, as you say, it's one of the barriers to independent companies like yours getting those commissions in the first place is being able to develop those ideas and turn them into something that potential commissioners can see and appreciate. And that was the benefit of this scheme, and I think so now it sort of behoves the BBC really, if this scheme is going to disappear or contract, to step in and to be able to do that job themselves better than we have in the past, to be frank, and to encourage independent production companies to come up with ideas that genuinely stand a chance of becoming a commission.
Right.
And I think, you know, that's the BBC's job. We have this very privileged position where we receive the license fee from the public, and therefore we need to spend that license fee wisely and encourage the industry around us, companies like John's, to benefit from the license fee by commissions coming from the BBC.
Can you, Andrew, let's shift a little bit and talk about the educational side, because right, BBC overall has an educational mission somewhat, and they could just be making TV shows that were educational, but what you do in your work adds a whole other level of depth to that. So can you talk about how that, the purpose of that, the mission of that with BBC?
Yeah, well, part of the BBC's stated mission is to educate, and we take that very seriously in the sense that we see it as formal education as well as informal education. So as you say, there are plenty of BBC factual programmes which have an education element to them, but we also see it as part of our duty to deliver the UK's curricula. So there are different curriculums for England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. They all have very specific requirements in whatever subject, you know, ranging from English through maths to geography, all of those things. So we create thousands of pieces of content on BBC Bite Size and on BBC Teach, which help deliver the UK's curricula. So they can be short form video content, some of it animation, some of it live action, interactives, games like the Horrible History one that I mentioned before, obviously lots and lots of text which has been thoroughly kind of looked at and conceived by educational consultants, so we work really carefully with them, and we're there to help deliver the UK's curricula and to help schools deliver the curriculum. So it goes a lot deeper than simple factual programme making, as you suggested.
And are there people actually like reaching out to the teachers to work with the teachers, or is it just we all know that it's there and it's available? Yeah.
So a lot of our educational consultants are also teachers, so we talk to them in that way, but also through BBC Teach and through things like live lessons which stream live into classrooms. We talk to teachers using that media, but we also have really close connections with them through sort of targeted emails, social media, to tell them what we're doing in that space and to get their advice on how best to deliver those products. So yeah, we have a very close relationship with teachers across the UK.
Some of the programs that you're doing, John, are also educational. It's not your sole mission, right? But it's educational. So when it goes back to something Andrew talked about in the very beginning about that blend between entertainment and education. How do you see what you're doing in the education space different than what Andrew's doing?
I suppose,
or BBC is doing?
Well, principally our focus would be to try and kind of win commissions that would be broadcast on linear channels. Perhaps a little more so than kind of short form content that would appear on website, which is more the majority of the kind of things that Andrew and his department are involved in. So, and therein lies a slightly kind of difficult thing really, because there's been, I think, quite a shift over the last few years within the UK. So there being commissioners in this country that are nervous about the word education.
So I want you to hold that thought for a minute, because we're going to take a short break. We're going to come back to talk about a little bit more about education and the point that you were just about to make. We'll be right back. Thanks.
When I was growing up, my mom was extremely tidy. We were trained to put things back where we got them from. One day, when I walked into my mom's house, I felt like I walked to someone else's house. There was stuff everywhere, and just growing up the way I grew up, and to see this transition was very alarming.
When Sean talked to me, it was a wake-up call, and that's when I went to the doctor.
You can achieve a lot using your imagination. I mean, I don't like to brag, but... Wait, who's that? And why is she all over these achievement awards? But with STEM, the sky's the limit. Shaboom! Use STEM to envision... Okay, I'm seeing it. Yeah. Invent...
Got any ideas?
I've got a few, actually. And create a better world.
Told you she's super smart.
If she can STEM, so can you. Find out more at She Can STEM.
So just before we went to the break, we were in the middle of hearing a comment from John about education. I'm sorry I cut you off, but if you remember where you were with that.
And that's the meaning of life.
There you go. Okay, on to something.
Yeah, so I was going to say that there's been a real shift in the last few years in the UK, particularly within the BBC, around kind of educational content. And I think where Andrew's kind of department is able to play to a very specific audience for a very specific purpose, the channels of the BBC have a very broad audience, so they're trying to cater for the masses. Now, education is a tricky word to kind of encourage children to watch, because that feels like a little bit of a kind of a worthy or a dirty word that who's going to want to kind of watch educational content.
We don't want to feel like we're in
So
school
there has to be an approach made that's the equivalent of putting medicine in jelly or medicine in yogurt for kind of kids to have. And there's been a change, as I say, towards us as broadcasters catering for an international audience. And so I sense the flavours of programming that we end up having are becoming more internationally uniformed. And then there is therefore less opportunity to make content that might be more specifically for the territory's audience, and thereby more specifically of a entertainment, educational kind of nature.
I think, sorry,
No,
Sherry,
yeah,
I think there is a sweet spot, isn't there, in that sort of early years, key stage one for young kids, where education does meet entertainment and doesn't put off the children. And so, for example, we're working with a brand called Number Blocks, which we work with on BBC Teach and BBC Bite Size, because the entertainment element of that is also very educational, but it's very specific and it's in that space. And I think you're right, commissioners are not afraid of that space and bringing education to that space, but when the kids get older, it's like, ooh, could be a bit worthy, So that's where sometimes we can step in and we can say, well, actually, what we can do is develop something slightly different to one side of this, which is what we've done with a series called Dodger, which has been a real hit amongst young people sort of age around sort of 10, 11, 12 in the UK. And we built some educational resources that are separate but feature the same characters. And that's one way of approaching this, which is kind of, if you're scared as a commissioner of this being too worthy, don't worry, we in education will go and do something over here with it. And so that's a different approach, and I think it's in some cases it's working.
Yeah, it's also, the shift for children is often when they go into formalized school. Like, it's easier to integrate educational content for kids when they're younger and they're learning, everything is brand new when you're 3 years old. But then once you move into actually spending the bulk of your day in school, then it becomes harder sometimes to say, okay, when you're out of formal school, here's some other thing. But I want to go back to your point, though, John, about international, because I would like to talk a bit about those trends and the future, and that international piece, and being, now that there are streaming services, how is that changing what you decide you want to create, and how that affects really both of the things that both of you do?
Yeah, that's a big question.
I
think we are going through an unbelievable period where we have come into and through the COVID lockdown, which has been a time you know, unlike any other that we've ever encountered, where we've had more time available to us than we've ever had before, and where consumption of media has gone up, you know, exponentially. As the streaming services have grown and ballooned in this kind of, I hesitate to use the phrase, but in the kind of the post-lockdown at least kind of period, many streamers are showing themselves as being at a size where it is unsustainably kind of big for them. We're seeing Netflix canning shows that are in production. I mean, as if it's not hard enough to kind of get productions away, then to kind of have a show canned in production must be, you know, utterly devastating, galling, and potentially putting companies out of business.
Absolutely. I mean, it's really financially difficult.
And so, yeah, we've got these challenges where some significant, very big players, I think, are really figuring out where they are in the international landscape, how they are commissioning into that. And many are taking this approach of fewer, bigger, better, which is kind of the mantra of the BBC. And as we kind of hear from a briefing point of view of what the BBC are looking to commission, fewer, bigger, better is the phrase that we keep getting. They want to have, they want to be known for the brands that can travel kind of internationally. And I totally appreciate where that comes from. As an independent production company, that makes it a lot harder to be making the shows that you want to make. Now, that's not to say I don't want to make a big, successful show, and I want to make a big one and fewer and better. I'd love to, but the chances of me coming
there's
up
just
with
less
a show,
opportunity.
Exactly, it makes it a lot harder.
And let's be honest, there are some things that, you know, are hugely successful here, but they won't travel.
Absolutely.
I mean, there's a great series about youth football called Jamie Johnson, which is a big hit for CBBC here. But that, you know, that concept won't travel. English grassroots football probably won't travel elsewhere, will it? So when you're thinking about commissioning brands, it would be a shame to lose something like Jamie Johnson, wouldn't it?
Absolutely, but it's interesting because I'm pretty sure on CBBC there's a show that is about I think it's an Australian girls football team. So that we do in this country, we are quite open to having kind of international tone come to us. Certainly as a UK, you know, we consume a heck of a lot of American kind of grounded kind of material, and there's not much of that going in the other direction in terms of children's content. There's obviously the market within America for, you know, Bridgerton and Downton and those. But
even that, it's on public broadcasting, right? You generally don't see that across the board. The idea of a child benefiting from the representation of their immediate environment, the value of that, does that sit high on your, you know, on your needs? Like, and you have younger children, John, too. So, like, is there a need to have both, or can we let go of the local kids playing local football, and it's okay if it's coming from Australia?
Well, I just think we need more confidence about what we're making and its potential to travel, which I guess is what John was saying, really, which is there's no reason why Jamie Johnson couldn't travel, but we have a perception in this country that that's something that feels very English and would stay, you know, very UK and would stay in the UK.
And I wonder what American commissioners would say, like, would they be open to that, right? And say, oh, let's try it.
Yeah, my sense from talking to international commissioners is that they don't have much of an appetite or budget to be taking in content that particularly live action kind of reflects other cultures. They don't have a prerogative for that. So I think that I think it's vital that children see themselves represented on screen, and that they kind of understand kind of who they are and reflections of their own kind of the specificity of their own culture within content. So it does sadden me and kind of worry me. I think that we are kind of moving to on generally kind of broad international could be consumed anywhere, where I think we just can't underestimate how, and never forget how young children are, how the fact that they are not developmentally at a stage where they can choose what is best for them. We are, you know, streamers are making it incredibly easy for them to consume, and they are not developmentally at a stage where they can make decisions about what is good for them and what isn't. And so that requires then a huge amount of work for the gatekeepers of the content.
Yeah,
both
but it's
commissioners
still,
and parents. And
but it is still, what we have to remember is it's still very much in the BBC's remit to reflect the UK and its culture.
Right.
And that's built into the license fee arrangements. It's built into everything that the BBC does. So maybe things, and I agree with you, they are moving in that direction, and we have to have an eye on how we can bring extra revenue into the BBC via international sales and all that. That's really important. But on the other hand, there's a counterweight to that still exists in public service broadcasting in the BBC, that we have to reflect our own culture, and that isn't going to go away either. So perhaps I'm a little bit more optimistic than you are about this.
But
Sure,
it's an interesting difference between US and UK sort of remits of the public broadcasters too, because I don't think that is part of what, despite the fact that there's so much American-based programming on American television and PBS especially, that cultural remit is not a direct part of what the requirement is. It's much more about education. So that's an interesting balance.
I think it's important to
there, right?
remember that actually it's a lot stronger now than it was, say, 25, 30 years ago. The BBC used to buy in many more programs from America, Australia than it does now.
Wow.
Because we really take that remit seriously about delivering on reflecting our own culture.
And I think there's a difference there with what is commissioned and what is acquired. And indeed whether things are co-commissioned kind of increasingly
Right.
kind of
Right.
with other,
For international
with other broadcasters.
co-production.
Because I understand the BBC's kind of position where it's always needing to justify the license fee and new revenue is needed to be brought in. Therefore, I understand the objective of commissioning in such a way that can eventually bring more money into the BBC. The acquisition piece of what do we bring to the UK kind of audience is different. I think there's kind of two parts to that.
No, you're right to make that distinction.
Is there, so this we're talking sort of about funding futures and thinking about content there. When I think also about the future of media, and we only have a couple minutes left, but do you, especially John, as you're looking to create new content, do you think about the metaverse and augmented reality and virtual reality and making things in those, using those sorts of methods?
I'm 44, so I barely.
Are you going to? I
understand
was going to say,
these
if you
things.
say you're old at 44, I'm going to be really upset.
Look, well, put it this way: I'm not someone who is a huge kind of social media user, so I don't pretend to be on the cutting edge of certainly social media. I mean, that said, we're in active development with an idea that uses virtual production as a principle, but that is to say, large LED screens that give photoreal kind of backgrounds that you could never achieve kind of in the real world. But I'm still very much kind of building on the foundations of my kind of basic televisual storytelling kind of skills. So yeah, there's an amount to which I will always try to be aware of the ways in which technologies are moving and how children are consuming media. That doesn't mean that I'm necessarily going to be trying to conceive of ideas in that space just because it may not fit my skill set.
Yeah, I mean, it's early days in BBC Children's, but there are groups looking at how we can, for example, brands like Jamie Johnson, which I mentioned earlier, could appear in the metaverse, how they would work there in a game like Roblox, for example.
Yeah.
So it is quite early days, but if we don't look at those things and we don't see which direction things are going, then we're going to kind of fall further and further behind.
Well, I think that's really a perfect place for us to stop, a very natural stop there. I did mention at the top of the show that there's a massive amount of content out there, and you're hearing just about a little of it. The shift to an online and streaming environment means kids have access to shows from other countries, although access doesn't mean they're watching it, featuring stories about cultures and people beyond their shores. So through this content, kids can develop greater empathy for others and their needs. But this access also means, and we didn't have a chance to talk about this, that it's easier for them, much easier for them, to stumble upon age-inappropriate content with disturbing images and adult situations. So it's more important than ever that families talk about how to navigate those media spaces. Thank you to my guests today, Andrew Tomlinson and John Hancock. For Media Inside Out, I'm Sherry Hope Culver. Thank you for watching.